Not too long ago, I read a book on the life and theology of Martin Luther. The book was titled Martin Luther, a guided tour of his life and thought. The book was written by Stephen J. Nichols, a graduate of Westminster Theological Seminary. Let me just begin by saying that this was the worst book I have ever read on Martin Luther from someone claiming to be a Calvinist. Only one from Westminster Theological Seminary could manage to misrepresent the life and theology of Martin Luther to the extent one finds in this book. The book is littered with mistakes, both historical and theological, but I will be focusing on those mistakes made by Stephen J. Nichols, which specifically attack the very essence of Reformed theology. I will begin with his incredibly erroneous teaching concerning the foundational principles of Reformed theology, known as the 5 solas of the Reformation. Stephen J. Nichols writes, and I quote, "Luther garners attention not solely for his involvement in the Reformation events, but also because of his role in shaping Reformation ideas. Perhaps more than any other person, Luther shaped the presuppositions that define Protestantism. Theologians use a series of Latin expressions to capture these concepts, known as the Reformation solas. They include Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone, Sola Fide, faith alone, Sola Gratia, grace alone, Solus Christus, Christ alone, Sola Deo Gloria, to the glory of God alone. These ideas all take root in Martin Luther's thinking." End quote. Taken from Martin Luther, A Guided Tour of His Life and Thought, Introduction, page 16. First of all, to say that Luther shaped the principles of the Reformation is to imply that they originated from Luther, and not from the Bible alone. Roman Catholicism often makes this same mistake when they argue against Protestantism. The same mistake Nichols is making here. The 5 solas were not shaped by Luther. They were discovered by him as he studied the Bible alone. Compare Nichols' Roman Catholic remark with a remark by the great Calvinist Gordon H. Clark. Clark writes, quote, "When we think of the Reformation, we usually think first of the doctrine of justification by faith, but the Reformers also discovered assurance. The proper word is discovered, for they came out of a medieval background of superstition and fear." End quote. From What Do Presbyterians Believe? Chapter 18, page 176. Gordon Clark is very clear. We do not shape, we do not make, we do not create the doctrines of Calvinism. We discover them from the Bible alone. Stephen J. Nichols, also in the paragraph I just quoted from in his book, leads his readers to believe that the 5 solas of the Reformation are all presuppositions. Here are his words again. Quote, "Luther shaped the presuppositions that define Protestantism. Theologians use a series of Latin expressions that capture these concepts, known as the Reformation solas." End quote. Notice that Nichols replaces the word presuppositions with the word concepts. Again, he is making the claim that the 5 solas are all presuppositions. This is another serious mistake, for only the first of the 5 solas, Scripture alone, only that one is presupposed. The other 4 solas are explicitly stated and or logically deduced from Scripture alone. A presupposition is that which we believe to be true without prior logical demonstration. Martin Luther did not presuppose justification by faith alone. Luther demonstrated the truth of justification by faith alone by sound logical argumentation from the Bible alone. At the Diet of Worms, he publicly challenged anyone to prove by logical argument from Scripture that he was wrong. Luther did not presuppose that man is saved by grace alone, but he demonstrated this truth by deducing it from the Scripture alone. Like I said, only the first of the 5 solas is presupposed to be true. The rest are to be demonstrated from Scripture alone. If one were to agree with Stephen J. Nichols' mistaken view here, that all the 5 solas are to be presupposed, then no one would ever offer a demonstration for justification by faith alone, salvation by grace alone, and so on. Expositional preaching in matters of soteriology would come to an end, and there would be no apologetic defense against Roman Catholicism. Well, not only does Stephen Nichols mess up the five solas of the Reformation. He outright attacks the first sola of the Reformation, Sola Scriptura, in part 3 of his book, in the chapter titled Luther the Pastor. On page 147, Nichols writes, and I quote, "Luther's primary devotion was to the church," end quote. First sentence in the chapter. Let me read it to you again. Luther's primary devotion was to the church. Let me just point out that as Protestants, our primary devotion is to Scripture alone. Our primary devotion is not to the church. Our primary devotion is to Scripture alone. The institutional visible church always comes secondary. The Bible always comes first. The claim that our primary devotion should be to the church is Roman Catholicism. That's not Protestantism. Stephen J. Nichols is teaching sola ecclesia. He's not teaching sola scriptura. And this is not the first time somebody out of Westminster or Philadelphia or Westminster, California has vomited out this Catholic nonsense. It's coming more and more. These people are heading back to the Roman Catholic Church, and they're producing students who are teaching Roman Catholic principles under the disguise of Calvinism. Well, if you don't think Stephen J. Nichols is Roman Catholic enough, if you'll just continue reading into his book, you'll find out on page 161 that he begins to actually advocate auricular confession to Calvinists. Let me give you this quote from Nichols. He writes, and I quote, "Once this confession is made to the pastor is to say, 'God be merciful to you and strengthen your faith.' Then he should ask, 'Do you believe this forgiveness is the forgiveness of God?' Once the person confessing answers, 'Yes, I do,' the pastor replies, 'Be it done for you as you have believed.'" Then Nichols adds, and again I quote, "Again, this may strike us, especially non-Lutherans, as odd, yet it may well be something worth thinking about," end quote. Page 161, the man is advocating auricular confession. This sacerdotal nonsense and superstition is not Calvinism, and this heresy absolutely needs to be rooted out of any Calvinist seminary. And the Westminster Theological Seminary is not reformed. They're teaching nonsense. Well, Nichols is not just satisfied with confessing his sins to a priest like a Catholic. He also has to take a shot at predestination, and he does so by attacking Martin Luther's greatest theological work titled The Bondage of the Will. In The Bondage of the Will, Luther clearly teaches the perspicuity of Scripture and the absolute predestination of God in all things. Luther's book destroyed the notion of free will and guarded justification by faith alone from those who would make the elect's act of faith to be the efficacious cause of his justification. A Calvinist cannot emphasize the importance of absolute predestination enough, but Stephen J. Nichols does not agree. Rather than stressing the importance of studying predestination in Scripture and defending it against those who propagate the heresy of free will, Nichols agrees with Erasmus, who argued for free will against Luther. Stephen J. Nichols writes, and I quote, "Perhaps the one element of Erasmus with which we would agree concerns his observation that the discussion surrounding this debate tends to promote more labor than fruit," end quote. From chapter 5, page 114 of his book. He's talking about predestination. Erasmus, he thought that discussing predestination just wasn't fruitful, and Stephen J. Nichols agrees with him. Look, such a remark is an attempt to steer people away from the study of absolute predestination. It is a tactic often found in Catholicism and Arminianism, but never in Calvinism. Gentlemen, these are not the statements of a Calvinist. They are the statements of an Arminian at best, and a Roman Catholic at worst. Like I said, I don't have enough time to go over all the heresies and mistakes I found in this book. It is a nightmare. If you want to get a good book on Martin Luther, let me recommend you get Roland H. Bainton's book, Here I Stand, A Life of Martin Luther. Bainton's not trying to teach Roman Catholicism, unlike Stephen J. Nichols here. So that's the book I would recommend.